Well, I sure appreciate everybody logging on. It's incredible to have this many people. And shoot, I'll be honest, it's a little intimidating just looking through all the names. The nice part about tonight, just kind of looking through what everybody has posted on there. I mean, we've even got some show pig breeders there in Laramie, if the Parker family's still on. Yeah, wealth of knowledge even watching. And so again, I appreciate everybody logging on. It's a pretty big honor to me to be able to do this. And so like Donnan said, originally from Laramie, and I've had an incredibly fortunate opportunity to have the opportunity to judge a bunch of shows across the nation, and even looking where a couple of you guys are from, had the opportunity to even judge a couple of your guys' county fairs even. And so that part's exceptionally exciting to see the amount of people. I'll tell you up front, I wake up in the morning and I thrive on questions. And so feel free, if you have questions, either put it in the chat box, or feel free just to shout out a question. So a majority of this lecture will be based around that. And if you're welcome, Parker family. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. A majority of this lecture will be, if you want to call it a lecture, I guess, very question-based, if you will. And so we'll just get rolling here. All right, did that come through? Can everybody see that PowerPoint?
Yes, it looks great, Colby.
All righty. So, in regards to show pig selection, and I'll tell you up front too, a majority of this, I'm going to try to relate to baby pig selection, and because I know we're getting close to the time of selecting your fair projects and selecting your show prospects for later on this summer. And so Don, is there a way that I can like see the chat while I'm presenting?
Possibly. What happens, like when I shared my screen, is it moves to the top left corner, and you'll see your little microphone, and then there's like a little call out buttons, and you hit the call out buttons, and it'll let you bring that chat box up. I don't know, since yours was kind of rearranged a little bit. I can see your cursor, but I can't see.
Colby, we'll just monitor it for you.
All right, that'll work. So again, if you got any questions, let me know. Feel free to just shout them out. So in the end, when we're talking about what is important at your county fair and what a judge is looking for one, especially for showing market hogs, muscle's pretty important, because obviously that's what we eat. And so these hogs need to have adequate muscle. Now, with that said, and something that I'm going to explain a little later on within this presentation, is muscle is not the end-all be-all, because we can get to the point where we almost have too much muscle and it starts to hinder skeletons a little bit. But muscle is very important. In addition to that, and it's especially important anymore to have an ideal amount of finish and fat cover, because, as I'm sure most of you do, I sure like bacon. And so having an ideal fat cover is important, because that correlates to a good eating experience, all right? And in addition to that, structure is of an utmost importance as well. And so throughout this presentation, when I talk about structure, predominantly what I'm talking about is how a hog skeleton is built and how that correlates to movement and motion. All right. And then on top of that, look and balance is pretty important. And one thing that I hope everybody gets after this little presentation is that in the modern day show pig world, balance, structure, and just quality is very, very important, because most of the time the top end of the hogs that will compete at a show will have enough muscle. What sorts most shows is having the right kind of look and something that can grab the judge's attention. And so hopefully I can explain that well enough within this presentation. And that's going to be what a majority of this presentation is about. Because one thing we can understand is that would you like to try some of that? Underneath the hide and underneath the fat and underneath the muscle and reading skeletons, that's really kind of an art. And so how I'm going to go through this presentation is I'm going to basically put you in the mindset of a judge. And so when we're selecting hogs in March or April, whenever you buy your pigs, you got to think about the views that are important to a judge. And so the first view that a judge will get of your pig is right there, coming right at the judge. If you ever watch, or if you've ever watched a hog show real intently, and if you've ever, well, for that matter, shown pigs in the past, you'll know the first view, or where the judge is going to stand when you first enter that ring, is right in front of your hog. And so with that being said, that first view is pretty darn important, because right away, before within the first 5 seconds of you entering the ring, judge has got a pretty solid idea of where you're going to go. And so skeletal width is pretty important. And I always say it's hard to build a brick house without a foundation. And so I made myself feel pretty old the other day, I gotta say, and I'm only 24 years old, but I made myself feel old because I was telling my high school kids that saying, and nobody knew the song "She's a Brick House." I was pretty disappointed, I guess, but anyway, so yes, you have to have a foundation in order to put any kind of muscle on. And one thing that I'm sure, again, I know the Parkers are listening, and so they raise baby pigs, and so I'm sure they understand that if you, as a baby, have the right kind of skeletal width, muscle will come. And so as babies, picking the heaviest muscled, most ripped up one necessarily isn't the greatest idea, because a lot of times those hogs can peter out later on in the summer. Now, with that said, don't pick a light muscled one, but just in terms of skeletal width, that is of utmost importance, because going back to the view that a judge is going to get, when when you first enter the ring, that judge is looking at chest width and to see if they are built square. And so like that first point that I have on there, skeletal width facilitates muscle growth and power up high, because if you are narrow at the ground, you can't, the body does not have the facilitation to put on muscle the rest of the way through. And so I've got a couple pictures here, and I'm glad that you guys can see my cursor, because I'll be using the cursor quite a bit. And so the next point that I have on there, width is very important, but squareness is exceptionally important, okay? And so this baby pig that I've got over on the left side, that's a kind of an example, and I couldn't find an even better example than this guy. This is a hog that isn't bad, but you can kind of see how that hog comes in at his knee a little bit. And so one way that I kind of, I guess, equate this to another species is if we had to pick between something that is in at their knee or in at their hock, or one that is bow-legged or out at their elbow, okay, on the right, there's kind of a decent example of a bow-legged one. If we had to pick between those, just for straight function, we would pick the hog we would pick the animal that's more in at their knee. And the reason being is, if you think about one of the most athletic animals in the world, we hunt them. Deer are some of the most athletic animals you'll ever find. And I have never in my life seen a square-legged deer. They're all sorts of twisty-legged. And so they can still function and they're athletic. The reason that we want them square, okay, is that, like I said, that facilitates width and power and muscle. And so this isn't necessarily a good hog in the sense that, oh, whoops. he starts to come in there at his knee, we would prefer him, this middle picture, that is an ideal kind of chest view. That hog is square in his knee. He's big chested, okay? That's very, very important as we start talking about later on within the summer and even going into the jackpot season, okay? Like I said, that width or that look right there is so crucially important because every judge in America is going to look at that view right when you come in the ring. And if you are wide-chested and square, you've already given yourself a shot to get a look later on. And so that is pretty important. Now, like that second, or like this point that I have, I guess, fourth down there, don't be fooled by hogs that are so wide, okay? Because if we get one that's bow-legged, looks like that hog has a lot of base width and a lot of power, but that's not necessarily a good thing. We need to keep them square-legged because if we're bow-legged, what happens is if we start putting pressure on the outside of their hock like this bear or like this boar does, okay, later on, once we get to a heavier weight, and I know this isn't a baby pig, I mean, that's a mature boar, but once we get to a heavier weight and a mature weight, that starts to put a lot of pressure on the outside of their legs, and we can actually cause swelling in their joints, and that's not a good thing. And same thing when they come at you, if you look at chest width and they're out at the point of their elbow, right there, okay? Again, they look really wide, they look really stout, but they're not square built, and that's how we start to cause structure problems, okay? And we're going to talk about structure here in just a little bit. But skeletal width is important. And like I was saying about muscle, that is a measurable type of thing. So that's one that anybody can see, okay? And so making sure that they are wide and square is very, very crucially important. All right? So along with skeletal width, something else that is absolutely critical in my personal opinion is their rib has to be built correctly. And I'm going to explain what this little circle diagram that I've got there means, okay? But when I talk about rib design, I'm talking from the top of their rib to the bottom of their rib. So from top to bottom, you should have equal width, but it's also important to have some boldness there in the center part of their body, okay? The reason that their rib cage is so critical is because my nice little drawing here, if we pretend that this is our rib cage, the white circle there, when there's some boldness and there's some squareness there, then we're going to pretend this is our muscle. So if you can picture this diagram, we'll pretend that this is their head up here, and we're looking straight down the middle of this hog, and I hope that makes sense. If we're looking straight down the middle of this hog, if we have a big round rib cage like that, we have two sides of their top muscle. And so it's just like any human too. We've got, if you feel right down your back, you should be able to feel some definition. There's two parts of your muscle, okay? This ain't gonna be on any test or anything, but just little trivial knowledge. That muscle is called the longissimus dorsi, all right? Now, for you younger kids, you don't have to remember that. But it's the best way I can explain it. And so that top muscle, okay, has to sit on something. And so when we make their rib correct, that muscle, we have facilitated a spot for that muscle to sit. And what that does is we can have the ability to make that muscle grow and flourish, essentially, okay? If we were to take each side of this rib cage and be flat, okay, then that muscle doesn't necessarily have a place to sit anymore. We don't have the natural ability to have that muscle sit on something. Nice smiley face or mad face. Okay. So here's a couple examples, and I got to apologize. My drawing on PowerPoint isn't very good, but here's some kind of 3/4 views of some hogs. And this Yorkshire gilt that we have right here, just by looking at the shadows, you can tell that that old girl's got some good curvature to her rib. And you can see, and I apologize, it's kind of a fuzzy picture, but you can see from the top of her body to the base of her body is all equal, okay? And so, like I said, it's important to have some curvature in the center part of their body, but be square from top to bottom. I hope that makes sense. All right. If we look at this hog here, the gilt on the right, we can see she's pretty flat ribbed. There's not a whole lot of curvature to the center part of her body. And also, this is another interesting thing that you can see is we've got a pretty big hog here on the right. That's a decent sized baby pig, and it should have more muscle over its top side than that, ideally, okay? So this is a perfect example. This one's pretty flat ribbed, but still pretty darn narrow topped, and so that's not a good thing, okay? We can see this gilt here has some curvature, and we have more width over her top side. So hopefully that makes sense how you can correlate that together.
Colby, there's a couple questions for you in the chat box. Can I just talk to you? One of them is, what happens when the ribs don't have that good structure?
So great question. So kind of like what I was talking, when they're flat bodied like that, they don't have the ability to be big topped. There's just not the physical ability to have enough top shape, or not necessarily top shape. We can put a bunch of top shape in. It's more so top width, and hopefully you can see my cursor there. All right. When they have a natural curvature and boldness to their rib, and one thing that I'm also going to mention that's important to know is if you talk to any hog breeder in America, they're all going to tell you that when you start studying rib cages, and one of my, I guess if you want to call him mentors, some of you may know Seth Ebert. He runs A Cut Above Genetics in Nebraska, and he has told me for forever that the way you study rib cages in hogs is right behind their shoulder, right where my cursor is going, okay? If they have some turn and they have some curvature, and you can see this old girl, the shadow right through here, you can tell she has some turn and some curve there. That is a good rib cage, okay? And so, again, to answer that question of why or what happens if they don't have that, quite frankly, they just don't have the ability to be big top. Kind of like this gilt over here on the right side. She's quite a bit narrower topped, okay? Is that a light muscled gilt? Absolutely not. But she does not have the same kind of top width and openness to their rib, if you will, that the Yorkshire gilt there on the left does. I hope that answered your question. We got another one, Jonathan?
The other one comes later when you start talking about feed. So we'll get to that when you start talking about maybe some feed things.
Okay, sounds good. And I'll tell you, I don't have necessarily any feed slides, but I'd be more than happy to answer feed questions to the best of my ability. So we'll get to that there towards the end, okay?
I guess the other one that just popped up, Colby, is one saying, can you see that rib cage shape as a baby pig when you're picking it out? Will you see that shape at that age?
Yes. So this is kind of, I know this Yorkshire gilt here over on the left is kind of, it's a little bigger than what you would necessarily buy them at. But yes, you should be able to see that. And actually, that's one of those things that you should be pretty good as baby pigs, and truly good as baby pigs, because they're quite a bit leaner. They don't have as much just fat cover on them. And so you should be able to see their rib cage a little better. Now, along with that, their rib will generally kind of develop along with maturity, okay? But trying to attempt to basically, if they have a good turn and they have a good curvature to their rib as baby pigs, it can only get better once you start putting fat cover on, once they start to mature and grow, okay? So you should be able to. Now, I do want to just kind of put the caveat to this out there. You know, that you know, having the right kind of bold rib cage is important, like I've already talked about. Now, if we've got baby pigs that look like the one on the right, I definitely do not want to call this one out on the right for being a bad one. That was just kind of an example of one that's just a little flatter ribbed, okay? So we're just talking about kind of the ideal baby, all right? Oh, yeah, whoops, hit the wrong button. Well, we can move on anyway. Again, hopefully that answered your question. If it didn't, let me know, and we can discuss it a little further. Along with this, okay, and this is probably almost a little more important in the sense that not only from a 3/4 view do we want to see some arc and curvature to their rib, another thing that is very, very important is they need to have some softness to their body. Okay, here is 2 drastic extremes. We've got a baby pig over here on the left, and obviously a more mature boar here on the right. So again, if we can put this, if you can imagine that boar being a baby pig, that will hopefully emphasize my point just a little more. We can see the one over here on the left has some softness and has some depth to its rib. Okay, has some depth through its flank, right where I'm pointing my my cursor there. Okay, now their flank is not their rib. Their rib quits right here. Okay, so that's why it's so important in their forerib right here. That's why it's so important to look right there for rib shape. Okay, rib shape, and that's when I'm talking about arc and curvature to their rib. That's when I'm talking about rib shape. Okay, but then once you get off to the side, they need to have some softness there. As you can see, this old boar, he's really shallow bodied from the top of his body down to his sheath is really shallow. The issue that poses, okay, is they are hogs that are shallow bodied like that, they're hard to feed. Hogs like that don't get fat real easy. And on top of that, I mean, you know, like I said, they are definitely hard to feed. If they look shallow and really hard and ripped up as babies, they're probably going to be pretty hard to make look deep-bodied later on in life. Okay, and so I think this is an outstanding picture for everybody to kind of get in their mind. And I know its tail and its head are cut off, but in my opinion, that's an outstanding look, or a really good picture there to kind of understand just what their rib and their body should look like from the side. Okay, in terms of depth. Okay, that's a hog that's still pretty lean, and it should be. It's a baby. But it's still got the right kind of depth, all right? And so ideally, kind of one thing to also to look for, if you want to take it to the next level and you're trying to win a competitive county fair or even bigger than that, another thing that's kind of modern and current and something that you'll come to understand about the show pig game is obviously you can create different generations of hogs very fast. And so with that said, the hog industry and what the hog industry is after changes very fast. And so one thing that's kind of modern and current and the trend, if you will, I hate that term generally, trends, but something that's trendy is for them to be kind of shallow up through their chest and then get deeper back to their flank. That also, and we're going to talk about this here in just a little bit when we talk about look and build, what that does, you're actually helping yourself a little bit when you select them like that, shallower in their chest than they are in their flank. You actually make them look a little taller fronted, and that's a good thing. Making them tall fronted is a good thing, and I'll emphasize that a little more here in a little bit, like I said. But it just helps their balance and design, and then on top of that, it helps just their feedability. Okay, if they've got some depth and some softness through their flank and their rear body, it helps them. It makes your job quite a bit easier in getting those hogs fed. All right. Okay. That picture is not supposed to be there. All right. So now that we have that out of the way, this is where the artistic stuff comes in. So after the judge gets a chest view, if you're wide skeleton, you're square, you're soft bodied, judge is already liking what you have. So the next look they get, you're going to turn them on the side, and that's where the judge will study build. If you are wide, you're square and big bodied, you're already going to be in the hunt. So then once you get on the side, then that's when you're trying to win that class. Okay. And so this is where the art comes in. So for one, making them good structured is of utmost importance, okay? Because if they can't move very good, if they are tight moving and not very good structured at 60 pounds, is it going to get any better at 275? It sure is not, okay? Take me, for instance. I don't walk very good, and the older I get, the worse I walk, all right? And so factors to consider within that, okay? It all starts at the ground, and I'm going to say that a million times. It all starts at the ground. The size and shape of their foot is very, very important, and I've got some pictures to show that here in just a little bit, okay? The angles of their skeleton are important, and I've got a couple of pictures that illustrate what I'm talking about, and so here in a couple slides, and I'll let everybody know what slide that is. Pay real close attention to my cursor, okay? And then on top of that, and this is probably as important as anything, is their actual flexibility and movement, all right? So the angles of their skeleton can help us predict how they're going to move, and on top of it, it goes just into balance and look again, like I was talking about. The foot size and shape correlates to these two factors of angle, or the angle of their body, and then their actual flexibility, okay? So here's a couple pictures of some feet. And so I'm sure, you know, I'm going to ask this question, and I know we can't all necessarily reply at once, but if you've ever put on a shoe that's way too small, you can't walk very good, right? And you almost want to tiptoe around. That's exactly the same thing with livestock, okay? When we got a little bitty tiny foot, okay, what happens is they essentially have to walk on their they have to walk basically on their tiptoes. And then here's how this problem compounds is, so if you have a tiny foot and the toes are really small, and you have to walk around on that all day on your tiptoes, all the pressure is on the front side of your foot. And so when the pressure is on the front side of your foot and you're walking around all day rubbing on your feet, you're essentially grinding more and more off the front side of your foot. You are compounding that problem, okay? And so what eventually happens is if all the weight is on the front side of your foot, skeleton basically rocks forward. And so talking about just angles of their skeleton, and I've got another slide that will actually show bone structure here in just a second, okay? But if you look from the top of this hog's hip, and this is one part where I want everybody to look at my cursor, okay? From the top of this hog's hip to the base of his foot is an absolute straight line. That is not a good thing, okay? Not a good thing. We need a 45-degree angle from the top of their hip down to their stifle joint and back to their hock. That hog does not have that, okay? And I'll explain that a little deeper when we can actually see bones, okay? Mainly just talking about foot structure here. Tiny feet and tiny toes are not good, okay? But on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have another hog here. Feet are a little bigger, but if you notice, his feet are long, okay? And so what happens there? When we have long feet, then what happens is all the weight is on the back side of their foot. And this, if you've got a hog with a hind leg that looks like you could win a greyhound race, not a good thing, okay? It's just not very attractive. And so that hog we can see has a lot of extra set to its hock, okay? And now if we had to pick between one of these, we'd pick the hog that has some extra set to its hock, because in my personal opinion, I correlate it to extra set, extra function, okay? A hog like this can at least take a longer step, which is important. But the downfall is if we got all of our weight back here, for one, we can already see this hog's getting some pretty bad confinement sores, okay? And obviously these aren't show pigs that we're talking about, or that these pictures are depicting. But we've got some confinement sores and some swelling there in his joints. That hog, or that gilt, I guess, isn't very comfortable. And if we think about this, with all of their weight back on the back side of their feet, okay, when we start thinking about wearing on their feet, all these feet are going to do is grow longer and longer, and we compound the problem that we already have. So I hope that makes sense. Ideally, what we want is a big square foot that is even in terms of toe size. So like this hog, on the left there is square-footed, but kind of tiny-footed. Okay? We want big square feet. So in regards to skeletal correctness, okay, and these are old pictures, and so forgive that. But if we look at the angles of this hog's shoulder blade, for instance, the one on the left, and this is another part where it's good to pay attention to my cursor here for a second, is that we have a 45-degree angle, and even though that hog's head's down, we can still see that there's some angle and slope to their shoulder. The reason that that is important, and heck, we can even look at it through their hip, okay, is if everybody follows my cursor, let's just talk about their hip back here. Since that hip has some angle, okay, that, and again, I'm talking from the top of their hip to their stifle joint, which is right here, okay. If we track that angle down to the ground, we would expect that that hog is going to step right here, okay? That's flexibility. That is a good thing. We want him to take long, fluid strides. And one thing, too, and I know I hate looking at pictures, and so I've got some videos here in just a second that I hope work. I hope the links work on the videos. We'll see of some baby pigs, and we'll look at kind of some examples of movement here in just a little bit as well. But let's look at the bad structured hog, okay? This is a hog that if we look at the angle of his shoulder is pretty darn straight. Same thing with this hip, okay? If we look at the angle of his hip, we can expect that hog is only going to step right here. That hog is so straight skeleton that it's almost to the point where I wouldn't expect that hog to function very good. Okay, he's got a really straight hind leg. His hip is very straight. And then on top of it, if you think about it this way, something else that goes into skeletal correctness is if I were to have you guys get on the ground and crawl, and I told you you cannot bend your arms when you crawl, what happens? You have to bend your back in order to move around. And so if you have to move your back to get around, that's not a good thing. We want bending to happen in their joints, not their spine. And you can just tell between these two pictures, the hog there on the right is higher up in his spine, okay, because he has to. That's where all of his flexibility comes from. This hog is quite a bit more natural and level in his top line. And so that is ideal. That hog doesn't have to rely on his spine to flex. And I'll show you a couple examples of videos here in a little bit. Okay. Now, I love this baby pig. That's a hog that's neat looking. Okay. But if we just look at skeletal correctness, okay, and I know we're kind of at an odd view to see this, but if we look at the top side of his shoulder to the base of his shoulder, we've got some slope, we've got some angle, and something else that's important to see is we've almost got like a backward C shape to his knee. And that is a good thing. We want some shape and some turn, if you will, to their knee, okay? Again, that correlates to flexibility. If we look at this hog's hip, he's got a really level hip, and that just comes into being attractive. A level hip is attractive. And again, look at the top of his hip, and he's got his leg cocked back, so it's kind of hard to see, okay? But actually, that's a good thing. If we could have our choice and it was an ideal world and you pick out the best hog possible, they should be able to bend their leg, clear back behind their tail, reach it forward, and push back, clear back behind their tail again. That is the definition of a good structured hog. And we'll see a video of one that's pretty good here towards the end of the slideshow, okay? But that's another one that you can drill this in your head. And actually, I sent the PowerPoint to Don. Hopefully, we can just share this PowerPoint with everybody, and so you have these pictures. All right? So we got another hog here that just in terms of being made correctly and having a good structured skeleton, this hog's pretty good, okay? Not bad. We've got some angle through its blade, good and level out through its hip, got some angle there through its hip and down into its hind leg. That hog looks really soft skeleton and good structured. Here's one issue, is if we look, this hog doesn't have a whole lot of strength in its pasterns. It's almost kind of what a lot of judges, you'll hear judges say weak-footed or weak pasterned, okay? That's exactly what that's talking about. Is he's almost like down walking on its dew claws, okay? As a baby, that's something that we would try to avoid, okay? We can look back at this hog and see that that hog has some strength there in its pasterns, and I know he's in deep shavings, and so it's kind of hard to see, but hopefully you can see there's some strength there in its pasterns, okay? The other issue that I would say with this hog is he's just kind of frail-legged. He's pretty frail-boned, okay? There isn't a whole lot of stoutness. If we look at this hog, he's got big legs, okay? And big legs, right, wrong, or indifferent, they win shows. So that's another selection criteria that you can have. And like I already talked about, having a big foot is important. And if we have big feet, generally we will have big bone, okay? Big bone is attractive, and judges like it. I am as guilty as anybody. When I judge shows, I love big legs, all right? And so that's one thing that I'd change in that hog. He's just a little frail-legged, okay? Here's an example of a hog that we can change some things in, okay? Again, here's an even better example of weak pasterns, okay? And look at its feet. There's another example of its feet that are getting pretty long. He's starting to get too down on his dew claws. And then on top of it, this is another example of one that's too straight in terms of its hip, okay? From the top of its hip down to its stifle joint right here and back to its hock. That isn't a great 45-degree angle. That one's pretty straight structured up through its hip, okay? And more so than anything, that's not a very good footed one. It's kind of weak on its pasterns, okay? And then here's an example, and again, I apologize for it being kind of a big mature hog here, but if you can picture it being a baby, that's the one that we can use as an example of one that's too straight up through its front end. From the top of his shoulder down to the point of his shoulder is pretty darn straight, okay? And hopefully everybody can see my cursor there. And then on top of it, hogs' knees are kind of hard to see, okay? Because they're not where every other livestock species knees are. They're almost down by their foot, okay? This is that hog's knee. And you can see, I talked about having a C shape. This one has a C shape. It's just at the wrong side, okay? You don't want it at the back side of their leg. It needs to be at the front side of their leg. That one is actually to the point where he is over in his knee, all right? So we're going to try this and see if it works. Can everybody see that video? Oh, no.
You see the link, Colby, but has it started on your screen? It hasn't started here.
Here we go.
There it goes.
Okay, sweet. So let's just watch and kind of talk about this particular baby. I'm actually going to, well, hold on. All right, let's just look at his picture here real quick. I would say based off of that picture, we've got a pretty darn good one there. It's little, it's a baby pig, okay? But that hog has some length up through its neck. That hog is taller fronted than it is in its hip. That's also a good thing, like I talked about earlier, okay? All goes into attractiveness, level hipped. We can obviously tell that hog has some reach and flex there. Angle of its blade, just based on a picture, looks pretty good, okay? So as we watch this video, and they're wanting to kind of go a little slow, but you can see his hind leg, he reaches clear back behind his tail, okay? That hog has some flexibility, and of course he's trying to chew on a broom the whole time. But on top of that, besides just skeleton and flexibility, that's a hog that I'd never worry about in regards to muscle. we don't want to watch Kano. That hog has plenty of muscle at that particular age. That hog's rib is built really, really good. And so I'm going to go back to this part in the video. So again, bear with me here. I hope you guys can see the shadows here, okay? But we can see that hog's got some curve there to his rib. He's got some width there in his hip. That hog has some stoutness to him, and that's a hog that I'd never be concerned about muscle. Now, is he just rip-roaring expressive? No, he's not. And actually, I see that as kind of a good thing at that particular age, okay? That's one that if you see a baby pig like that, that's a pretty darn good baby pig, okay? All right, let's look at the old red hog here. Is that video still coming up? All right.
Yes.
So right there, to me, my first, and actually, I'm going to set this real quick. We're going to put this video on loop. They only made this an 8-second video. But I'm thinking right away right here, that's another hog that looks pretty decent, just based off of a picture, okay? If you see, and this isn't a great video, mainly just because they never actually let him get out and move. But do you see how he kind of almost wants to jab his hind leg there into the ground? On top of that, the other thing that I want everybody to see is he almost wants to step outside of his skeleton just a little bit. As a baby pig, that's something that would kind of worry me a little bit. Yeah, that's something else that's important to look at that I didn't necessarily talk about when it comes to skeletal correctness. Is we need them to step in line with their skeleton, okay? We don't want them coming in, but we also don't want them stepping outside, okay? We need them to be square. A good hog will be even width from the top of their body to their feet, and that goes into tracking as well. And so that's something that's very, very important to look at. That hog wants to step outside of himself just a little bit, particularly towards the end of that video. And so I hope everybody can see that. So that's something that would be a concern to me. I don't like this hog probably quite as good as the other one, mainly just because I think his hind leg travel is just a little shorter stepping, and he wants to step outside of himself. Okay.
Colby, can you put your cursor on that when he's walking of where you're talking? He looks outside of his structure where you're seeing that?
Yes. So what I'm talking about, and that's a great point, Jonathan. So when I'm talking about them getting outside of themselves, is if you watch this hog, and it's really hard to see, all right? And we've got, I think, another video, if I remember right, of a hog where you can see this probably just a little bit better. And that's what sucks about this video is it's only 8 seconds long. But this hog, you can kind of see up through his hip where his hind leg sets down actually is kind of outside of his framework. Yeah, dang. Too short of a video here. Okay, but you see how hopefully it makes sense. He almost wants to just do one of these numbers. And I hope everybody can see that. Did that kind of make sense, Jonathan?
Thanks.
Yep, no problem. All right, so that's my concern. Not a bad hog. That one's decent. He just needs to be better in that particular regard. I'm going to pull up another one here. Oh, all right. So this actually is another video with a couple. Whoa. Can everybody still hear me if I pause the sound?
Yes.
I don't want to listen to the music. Okay. So this is a couple different examples of babies, and these aren't quite as high resolution videos. But here's an example of a hog that actually starts to, or actually kind of does concern me from a muscle standpoint. because of the fact that if we watch this hog, and so you kind of see how he's almost kind of like flat down through his stifle and his lower rump there. He needs to have just a shot more muscle, but skeletally, this is exactly what I was talking about. And he's not bad, but this hog, if you watch him move around, he'll actually pull up there in his top line. And that's because of the fact that he's just a little straighter bladed, straighter up through his shoulder. And again, what I'm talking about, top of their shoulder to the base of their shoulder, okay? See how I almost want to pull up there in his top line, just a nickel, okay? So, and we can start to see there, as soon as he puts his head up, he actually has to rock forward, especially you can see it there in his knee. He has to rock forward in order to get his head up, okay?
Isn't it?
And obviously we got a little breed type working in there. I don't know if any of you are Duroc fans, but that was the main hog that I wanted to show there. Actually, here's another part. So this is a good rear view of a hog here. And I haven't had a great rear view of a hog within this particular video because, like I said, chest width is very, very important because we can kind of manipulate, if you will, width from behind by being bow-legged and stuff like that. But that is a very square hocked hog, okay? Again, he is exactly what I'm talking about as far as being square. The width from the top of his hip is equal down to his foot. That hog is very, very good in terms of his width and squareness. That hog has a big top in him. He's big hipped, okay? That hog has a great shape and a great squareness there from behind, okay? That's a good rear view of a hog that you can kind of drill in your mind a little bit.
Colby, I think somebody had a question. Did somebody start to ask a question?
Now, here's another hog. This is a bear that's actually kind of in the midst of show season, if you will, in regards to jackpots. This hog's a little bigger than the babies that you would be selecting. And I guess for you teenage girls out there, you get to see a guy without his shirt on. So, but this is another example of a hog that's really pretty darn good. He's square there in his knee, okay? We see him, that hog has a long neck that sits on top of his shoulder, so you can see how high he gets his head out. I guess this is a gilt, my apologies. See how high she gets her head out, and that's a good thing. When they are tall-fronted and their head comes out of the top of their shoulder, again, it's attractive. They look proud, okay? That hog, again, you can start to see body. That hog has a good width there to its body, or a good depth, excuse me. Some shape to her rib, okay? Now, she'll want to pull up right there in the middle part of her back, and part of that is because she's just a little straighter hip. She's not quite as flexible as what she needs to be, but you can still see she reaches her foot back past her tail. She's still got some flexibility working in her favor. That's kind of another example of a hog that you can just put in your head as an attractive one. I mean, that's an all-out show pig, okay? And so that's important. One thing to look at is babies, and we're getting into kind of looking at some kind of advanced stuff, if you will. But it's something that you can look at as babies. Their head correlates to a lot of things, okay? This hog, as weird as it may sound, one of my favorite parts about that guild is her head, okay? She's got some width in her skull, okay? And so when they have width over their skull, that correlates to the rest of the way back. And so if you think about one of the skinniest guys you know, do they have a very wide jaw and a very wide head? They probably don't. Now, if you look at me, for instance, I've got a big old face, and so I'm a wide guy. It just correlates to the rest of the width the way back. And so a big, stout skull, big, stout jawline is important too, okay? And that's something that you can see as baby pigs. So like I said, that is a good example of a hog that's good to look at and kind of drill in your head is just an attractive crossbred hog, okay?
Colby.
Plants its hind leg, reaches clear back behind its tail. Okay.
Colby, can you hear me?
And the last one.
I don't think he can hear us, Jonathan. I'm not sure why.
Okay, this is kind of an example of one to be just a little more leery on as a baby pig. And this is a pretty darn young one here. And I'm going to start picking it up here. I know I'm running a little late. Okay, you see how restricted that hog is when it comes to movement? I've been showing you a lot of pictures of videos of some good ones. What I want you to watch is his hind leg. You see how short of a step he takes? That starts to concern me. Okay, nice drawing. That hog gets pretty restricted, and watch what his spine does. It pulls up right in the middle part of his back. Okay, and on top of it, oh no. Okay, and on top of that, once we start talking about everything else other than structure, I know I'm hitting structure pretty hard. Like I said earlier, that is the hardest to read, and so that's why I'm talking the most on it. But on top of that, that's kind of a light muscled hog too. That's a hog that doesn't have a whole lot of bone, a whole lot of just substance. And on top of it, he doesn't have a whole lot of muscle or width really anywhere. Okay, so that's a hog that you can kind of drill in your head as one that isn't the greatest skeleton and honestly needs a little more muscle too. And you can see he's kind of got, for a lack of a better term, kind of a wussy looking head on top of it. Okay, so skeletally, that's where that hog needs changed. I hope those videos helped. Okay. All right, so we'll go back to the PowerPoint here. All right.
Colby, can you hear us now? I don't think you can still.
Hi, can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Colby, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
There are quite a few veterans of sale barns here. Fresh face, also making his debut on the national stage. And he's turning heads. It's the first year 18-year-old Blaine Watts is eligible to compete.
Sorry, there we go. Okay, I don't know what happened there.
No, you're good. We have some questions, Colby. Is that all right?
Yeah, let's go for it. This would be a good time.
The first question here is, why do you need a square body?
So, another great question. And so there's a couple different reasons. One is if they are square, one, it's just appealing to a judge, plain and simple. I guess that's the easy answer. It's appealing. And then on top of that, once you start thinking about the practical reason behind it, is for one, if they want to bow their legs out, that starts putting pressure on their joints. Once we start putting weight on and we start getting swelling in their joints, that isn't a good thing. Two, or I guess I shouldn't even say two. In addition to that, if, let's say, like I said, if they're bow-legged, they have width for sure, but to the point where it hinders their skeleton and they start putting pressure on their joints and it doesn't feel good to them. Okay. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, let's say they want to hock in just a little bit, or they get too in at their knee. The purpose behind that is, or the reason we don't want that, is because then we don't have the ability for them to put width up high. Is because if they are narrow down at the ground or even in their joints, you know, like I said, if they want to hock in or too in at their knee, then they don't have just the natural ability to put width the rest of the way up. And so it's kind of like, you know, I would equate it to, you know, if you think about just humans too, I like to equate things to humans. If you were to equate it to humans, if we are narrow skeletoned anywhere, okay, we don't have the ability to necessarily be big. So a skinny guy, for instance, if you think of the skinniest guy, you know, that let's just talk about their, and I know I'm talking about rib cages and not necessarily squareness here, but they're not very wide. And so they don't have the ability to be real stout. And that was a bad example. But I hope by just my example of if they're in at their knee, they don't have the ability to be wide anywhere else. And if they're out at their elbow or bow-legged from behind, then we start putting pressure on joints and swelling starts to occur. And it all comes back to, once again, it's appealing to a judge. So that would, I hope that answered your question. That was a roundabout way of getting there, but we made it.
Perfect. Okay, there's a couple more. Do you prefer a long body or a short body pig?
You know, that's actually a great question too. My answer to that is yes. They have to be adequate in terms of body length. And so, and that's a hot topic. That's an outstanding question because what a lot of guys will tell you, and if you ever look at a lot of the show winners, let's just say, I mean, it's popping into my head. The hog that won Fort Worth this year. And if you go and Google Champion Barrett 2019 Fort Worth stock show, that hog in the grand scheme of things is actually pretty short bodied. And so market hogs, a lot of judges will actually prefer them maybe just a little shorter bodied. I'm not quite that way. I think we need to be adequate and they need to balance. And that's actually probably the better thing to keep in mind is length of body. If they're too long bodied, they don't balance. They need to look proportional is probably the best way that I could put that. And so, like I said, a little bit of both. We need to find a happy medium to where they balance and more so than anything, they're proportional.
Perfect. Okay, I think there was somebody that was going to ask a question that tried to unmute themselves. Did anybody want to do that? No? Okay, I thought somebody tried to unmute themselves. Okay. Does the width of the rib affect feed efficiency?
Sure can. Sure can. There's a lot of guys that'll tell you, and I'll be the first to tell you that I don't feed a whole lot of hogs. And so, you know, heck, the Parker family that's on here, and you know, there's a majority of you on here that I saw that feed more hogs than I do. But what I will tell you is livestock species in general is if they are wide-ribbed and they are deep-ribbed, they are generally a lot easier to feed, and they can gain better too. And in relation to your feed efficiency question, generally they will gain better. Is if their rib, the width of their rib and the depth of their rib is big, just in general, they will be easier to feed. And yes, they can be more efficient. Efficiency is kind of a delicate term, if you will, just in the sense that sometimes, and I'm thinking of cattle in the sense that, you know, sometimes big, tall, shallow things, if you put them on a feed efficiency test, sometimes they gain the best and they just put all their gaining into growing up rather than what's important, which is out. And so efficiency is kind of a delicate term. But what I will say is if they are wide rib and deep rib, a lot of the time that will help with making them look right in the end and helping them gain in the right way, if that makes sense.
All right, there's one more that's connected to selection. If a hog looks good when they're young, will they stay that way, or can they lose some of their nice features as they get older? If so, what are some of the things you can do to prevent them from losing attractive features?
Okay, great question. Great question. So, yes, hopefully, if you've got a good-looking hog as a baby and they are sound structured, they are good built, they're tall-fronted, they're long-necked, yes, hopefully that will stay the same. And especially, one thing that I will tell you is, again, selecting on structure as babies is so critical. Structure and width, skeletal width, not necessarily muscle, skeletal width is so critical because of the fact that if they are sound, that generally will not change. And then a skeleton is hard to change. Now, I'm going to put a caveat to that in the sense that, and I'm going to put it in the example of a steer that I had when I was in high school. I had a steer that was pretty darn straight hipped, and he wanted to knuckle up in his pastern pretty bad. And what had happened to that calf is I just thought it was a stress thing, because sometimes those cattle will start to get a little tight structured when they get stressed. And I know this is show pigs, but all of it kind of correlates. But with this steer, what had actually happened was because he was so straight and he had to put all the weight on the front side of his foot, it actually can shift their whole skeleton forward as they start to mature and compound the problem. And so to answer your question in regards to what are some things that you can do to prevent making them look worse as they get older, for one, structure. Make sure they are sound moving and flexible as babies, and attractive as babies. And again, making sure that they're tall fronted and they got some extension up through their front and stuff like that about their neck. Very, very important, because that should stay all the way through. Now, in regards to, let's say you have a good-looking baby pig that's sound, tall-fronted, good-looking, some things to prevent, that from going away is don't get them too fat, for instance. I would say a lot of hogs get to the point where they almost get too chubby, and sometimes they'll get a little jolly. Their neck won't look quite as attractive once they get a little fatter, or a little too fat. Let me put that little caveat on there, is too fat. Okay. And it's hard for me to tell you just over a PowerPoint what's too fat, what's too lean. My greatest, and this is a cop-out answer here, but my greatest answer for that question is if you look at, and I know this doesn't necessarily relate directly to your question, but in terms of ideal finish at the end, look up hogs on Google and make sure you're looking at hogs that win major shows like Houston, San Antonio, Denver, Louisville, Kansas City, hogs like that win major shows or state fairs for that matter. And that should give you a pretty good indication of optimal finish. And the reason that I'm talking about optimal finish and stuff like that is, like I said, you start to get pretty jolly and not quite as attractive up through their front. So again, that was a long way to answering your question, but I hope that answered your question good enough.
Okay, there's a couple more questions I think we can save to the end that are kind of like summary questions if you want to continue.
Okay, well, we're almost to the end of the material that I have for you. But we talk about all this, making them good looking and stout enough and skeletal width, but heck, none of it matters if we don't make weight or we don't get to our optimal endpoint. And so that is a very, very important thing to keep in mind, okay? So as far as what is the ideal weighted to show, most of the hogs that will be in the hunt to win overall, they are 275 pounds, roughly. If you're within that range, you'll be in the hunt, okay? At 275 pounds, hogs will generally look right, and that's an ideal market weight, right about. And so if we think about what a pig gains a day, we can generally figure on about 1.5 pounds a day, roughly. You can push them a little heavier, push them or hold them back a little lighter, but that's a pretty good indication of what a hog on average will gain a day. And so when you're just figuring on your math, hold on one second. If you're just figuring on math, if you buy a hog on March 15th, for instance, what you need to do is calculate from the day you buy your hog to the day of your show or the day of your weigh-in at your county fair or whatever your endpoint show is going to be. This is the way to do your math. So let's just say if you buy a hog on March 15th, target weight's 275 pounds on August 1st, There's 139 days in between March 15th and August 1st. So 139 days times 1.6 pounds. We have to gain 222 pounds within that time frame. And so you can have the ability to buy a hog that weighs 53 pounds and feel comfortable that you can get it weighed in at 275 at your county fair if your nutrition and feed program is adequate. And so now if you're just trying to make weight, most county fairs, I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, most county fairs are 220 on average. I'd probably say that's the average minimum weight in most of the shows that get the opportunity to judge or go to. And so obviously you can buy a hog that's a little lighter than that, or if you even want to play in the lightweight division, then yeah, you can kind of adjust weights from there. But that's how you do the math, and that's what's important to understand. So size is important. Beyond just making them look good and stuff like that, like I said, none of it matters if we don't make weight or if we don't get them to the target weight where they look their best and can be in the hunt to win the show. And that is the end of the material that I have as far as a PowerPoint is concerned. And so with that said, ask away on any question that you may have. And again, I'm going to go clear back to the beginning of this show, or the slideshow here. There is my contact information. One thing that I will definitely say is I'm kind of an open book. I can help to the capacity that I am able to. And so feel free to jot down my number, give me a call. Probably with me teaching school, shooting me a text before you call would be real ideal. I'm a millennial. I'm an avid texter. So, or shoot me an email too. I'm more than happy to answer any questions anytime throughout the year. And heck, I'll even put the caveat on there too, that let's say you're at a pig sale and you got a question if a hog looks good, I'd be more than happy to look at a video for you or anything like that. So more than happy to help. I love this organization. For those of you that are showing pigs, I thank you for doing it. I thank you for being a part of showing livestock. I can guarantee you there is not a better thing that you can do than be involved with 4-H and FFA and showing livestock. So with that said, any questions that anybody has, I'm more than happy to answer.
So Colby, there's one more that's in the chat box connected to selection. It says, can you have the pig to have not wanted features such as straight bone, but can you work with them to get the good features? Will exercise help get those good features?
So that's another good question. That's a question that I actually get quite a bit. So in regards to a straight skeleton, heck, let's just buzz ahead here real quick. A skeleton won't change in the sense that by exercise and stuff like that, if you already have one that's too straight in their skeleton, it's probably going to be straight the rest of its life, and it's probably going to compound the problem. Now, in regards to exercise is important. I definitely don't want to put a mistake on that, because if you have one that is built correct, when they're babies, when you buy them, and if they are built right, they're sound structured and they move good, but you take them home and they're on solid concrete without pretty deep shavings, or and you don't get them out and walk them very often, then even if they are the most perfect structured animal in the world, they're going to move tight. It's just like any of us. If we sit in a car for 12 hours at a time and don't get out, we get out and we feel like old people, and we don't move it very good. And so that's my answer to that question, is if they are straight skeleton, then it ain't going to help them. Later on with any kind of exercise. You could run them 20 miles a day and it isn't going to help them. But if you have one that is built right as babies, exercise will help them.
Okay, thanks, Colby. So with that, before we open it up, is that there's a couple more chat questions, but because of the lieu of the time is that some of you guys, I'm going to push you off, is that tonight was really going to focus on selection, and we have done a great job with that. And so there's some questions in the chat box that had to do with feeding, how much to feed, what to feed, things like that. I guess I would encourage you to join us on April 17th. Krisha Custis is going to be going over that, Gifford, as far as the feeding part of it. And so not to push you off, but I know that could lead into a huge conversation as far as feeding and what to feed and things like that. And I don't want to carry this on too late tonight. So I would
Krisha's going to be better about feeding than even I will be. Krisha's great.
So I suggest that. There was some questions about clipping, and do you need clippers? Also, not to push you off, but on May 6th, we have a daily care and Showbox tip one that we're going to be going over kind of the equipment that you need, what you should have in Showbox, that type of thing. And we're definitely going to be talking about clippers in that and what blades to use, things like that. So that's going to be by Steve Harrison. So those, I don't mean to push you guys off, but I also want to make sure that we're cognitive of our time. So there is going to be a couple more questions in here that says, if they keep on concrete, can that change the skeletal structure?
So great question. It darn sure can. If they are on just straight concrete, and I will tell you that I actually prefer when my family showed pigs, we concreted our barn, one from just the ease of cleaning, but on top of it, it can be good for skin and hair and stuff like that. And I'm sure who's doing the daily care portion side of things can expand a little bit on that. The biggest thing is keeping them on deep shavings on concrete is so important, because keeping them on concrete won't necessarily change their skeleton, but it can change their movement. If they are on concrete all the time, rock solid concrete, it hurts. It's just like if we were to go lay down on concrete all the time, we're probably not going to move the best either. And so if it can affect their movement. Won't necessarily change the angles of their skeleton and stuff like that per se, but it'll darn sure change their movement, and it'll make them move just a little tighter. So that would be my answer to that question. I hope that answered it good enough again.
Perfect. Okay, so I think that's all of them in the chat box related to that. Does anybody else? There's some questions that I guess I'm going to curb for Colby, is about asking him if he's going to judge. I'm not going to. I think that's information that maybe my answer to him, I'll answer for him, is I am sure you will see him judge at some fairs across the state, across some other states. I know a couple of neighboring states that he's going to judge, but I'm sure that he doesn't even have all those with it. So there's just a couple more coming in there. Are gilts or barrels better? Do you have a preference?
Here's what I'll tell you. So gilts will generally be a little harder muscled. And what I mean by that is they'll be a little more expressive. Gilts are actually, pigs are quite a bit different than other species in the sense that ewes get fatter than wether sheep. Heifers get fatter than steers do, quicker. When it comes to pigs, they are absolutely just the opposite. A barrow will get fatter faster than a gilt, okay? And that can be good or bad. It could be good in the sense that if you're trying to feed a barrow and now I'm not even going to go down that road. That could be kind of a long conversation. I don't have a preference. My take is if I'm judging a show, I'm going to use the best hog there, whether it's a gilt or a barrow. And so that would be my recommendation, is just find the best hog. I know that's kind of a cop-out answer, but the best one should always win. And so I don't have a preference from a judge's perspective. I'm talking about this from a judge's perspective, not a feeder's perspective. From a judge's perspective, I don't have a preference.
Perfect. Okay, that sounds good. We're going to take one more question, and then what we're going to do is, so we can finish up for tonight and be in lieu of everybody's time, is that if you have other questions, I encourage you guys can send me an email and I can forward it to Colby. Colby gave you his information as far as that goes, but this is just kind of a final follow-up to your conversation, Colby, about the concrete and the question is raising a pig on dirt much different than raising on concrete?
I think what that mostly comes down to is skin and hair. And that's another thing that I didn't really talk about is it doesn't necessarily correlate to baby pig selection per se. This kind of comes back to more so management. Keeping care of skin and hair is so critically important. I have seen in my time judging shows, I have seen a tremendous amount of hogs that are pretty good, but they have a real stale, kind of dry, dingy skin and hair, and that makes a difference. And so the answer to the difference between dirt and concrete is dirt can a lot of the time make dirt and mud. Mud holes, I will tell you just up front, and pretty much anybody will tell you this, mud holes are not good for skin and hair for a show pig. Yes, does it provide sun protection? It sure does. But keeping hogs inside and taking care of skin and hair is of utmost importance. So important in keeping them clean. So that's why I personally, this is personal preference speaking here, I personally like concrete because it's easier to keep clean. It's easier to keep your bedding clean, and it's quite a bit easier to make sure that skin and hair stays correct. And so, again, that's personal preference, and I know that a lot of people don't have the ability to keep them inside and on a concrete floor with heavy shavings, but that is just my personal preference. So that's what I would